In 376 CE, Rome agreed to let 200,000 Goths cross the Danube. 4 years later, those same Goths killed the emperor at Adrianople. Why do empires suddenly lose control of borders they defended for centuries? What can history teach us today? Here's the weird part. Rome had held that same stretch of river for 3 centuries. The legions that held the Danube were considered the best-trained fighting force on Earth. And then, in a single administrative decision, the border dissolved. Was it the border collapse that killed Rome? Or was Rome already dying, and the border just showed the symptoms? Because here's what the historical record reveals. 5 major empires lost control of their frontiers in strikingly similar ways. Han China, Western Rome, the Abbasid Caliphate, Byzantium, Qing China. And in every single case, the border didn't fail first. Something else broke. And when it did, the frontier became a door that couldn't close. Let me show you the pattern with actual numbers from the sources. The Han dynasty spent 50% of its annual budget defending the northern frontier against the Xiongnu by 150 CE. Within 70 years, the dynasty was gone, but the border crisis started appearing in official records 40 years before the final collapse. Rome's Rhine-Danube frontier required 300,000 troops and cost roughly 70% of imperial revenue by 350 CE. The empire in the west lasted another 126 years, but it stopped being able to pay those troops around 400 CE. The Abbasid Caliphate controlled borders stretching from Spain to Central Asia in 800 CE. By 861 CE, Turkish slave soldiers had murdered 3 caliphs in a row. By 945 CE, the Buyids, a Persian military dynasty, occupied Baghdad itself. The borders hadn't moved yet. The ability to defend them had evaporated. Byzantium lost the Battle of Manzikert to the Seljuk Turks in 1071 CE. That single defeat opened Anatolia, the empire's heartland, to Turkish settlement. But here's the detail that matters. Byzantium had been strip mining its own military system for cash for 30 years before that battle. The troops at Manzikert weren't paid. Many didn't show up. The Qing dynasty signed the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 CE, ceding Hong Kong and opening 5 ports to British control. That's not a border collapse, that's a forced door. But the Qing couldn't close it because by 1850 CE, the Taiping Rebellion had pulled every available soldier into the interior. The border became irrelevant. Do you see it? The border doesn't fail because invaders get stronger. It fails because the empire can't afford to defend it anymore. And that raises a question we'll answer in the next 10 minutes. What breaks first? What's the actual sequence? Because if we can map the timeline from internal weakness to border collapse, we can see the warning signs. Here's what you're about to learn. First, the 4-stage pattern that appears in every case. Military overextension, fiscal collapse, negotiated settlement with outsiders, loss of control. It's not random, it's a sequence. Second, the exact timeline for each collapse, how long it actually took from the first cracks to the end. How long from the first economic crisis to the border breach? How long from the breach to the collapse? We're going to move fast, 60 seconds per empire, but every date is specific, every number is sourced. Third, the root cause analysis. What actually preceded the border loss? Was it always money? Was it political fragmentation? Was it something else? And here's the part that surprised me when I mapped it. The answer isn't the same for every empire. And finally, what this means for understanding how empires actually fall. Because if border loss is a symptom, not a cause, then the question becomes, what are we really looking at when we see a modern border crisis? By the end of this video, you'll be able to recognize the pattern in real time. And that might be the most uncomfortable thing you learn today. But we need to start with the sequence, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every empire in this analysis followed the same 4-stage pattern. Let me show you the structure before we dive into the specific cases. Stage 1. Military overextension. The empire expands to a natural geographic limit, a river, a mountain range, a desert, and then tries to hold that line indefinitely. This works for decades, sometimes centuries. but it requires a standing army that never shrinks. The cost is fixed, the revenue is not. Once you've overextended your military, stage 2 follows like clockwork. Fiscal crisis. Something breaks the tax base. A plague, a civil war, a climate shift that wrecks harvests. Doesn't matter what triggers it. What matters is that the empire can no longer fund the border at full strength. The troops don't get paid on time. Equipment isn't replaced. Forts are abandoned in the less critical sectors. Stage 3. Negotiated settlement. Here's where it gets interesting. The empire doesn't lose the border in a dramatic invasion. It makes deals. It invites groups across the frontier as allies, as settlers, as federated troops. The language in the official records is always the same. We are granting them permission to enter under controlled conditions. But the control is an illusion. The empire has already lost the ability to enforce the terms. Stage 4. Loss of control. The groups that entered under negotiation realize the empire can't expel them. More groups cross. The empire fragments the border into zones of influence, each controlled by a different warlord or tribal confederation. The frontier becomes a porous membrane. And then, sometimes quickly, sometimes over generations, the empire's core territory starts to break apart. That's the pattern. Now let's watch it happen 5 times. Han China. The dynasty reached its maximum extent under Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE. He pushed north into the Ordos Loop, building fortifications and garrison towns to contain the Xiongnu Confederacy. By 150 CE, the cost of defending that frontier consumed half the imperial budget. But the Xiongnu weren't the problem. The problem was that a series of floods and famines in the 150s and 160s CE collapsed tax revenue in the central provinces. The troops on the frontier stopped receiving regular pay. In 184 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion exploded in the interior, a peasant uprising that required every available soldier to suppress. The northern frontier was denuded. By 190 CE, regional warlords were inviting Xiongnu groups to settle inside the border as allied cavalry. The Han court approved these arrangements because it had no other option. The dynasty officially ended in 220 CE, but the border had effectively dissolved by 195 CE, 25 years earlier. The Xiongnu didn't conquer Han China. They walked into a vacuum. Western Rome. By 350 CE, the Rhine-Danube frontier required approximately 300,000 troops. The imperial budget could not sustain this. Emperor Valens, facing a fiscal crisis and a military manpower shortage, made a decision in 376 CE. He would allow the Thervingi Goths, maybe 200,000 people, to cross the Danube and settle in Thrace as foederati, federated allies. They would provide troops. Rome would provide land. The deal collapsed within months. Roman officials exploited the Goths, selling them food at extortionate prices, withholding promised supplies. In 378 CE, the Goths revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople on August 9, 378 CE, they killed Emperor Valens and destroyed 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army. But here's what matters. Rome didn't fall because of Adrianople. The Western Empire lasted another 98 years. What Adrianople proved was that Rome could no longer control the groups it had invited inside the frontier. And once that became clear, more groups crossed. Vandals, Alans, Suevi, Burgundians, not as invaders, as refugees and opportunists who understood that Rome couldn't stop them. The last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 CE, but the border had been irrelevant since about 410 CE, when Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome itself. The Abbasid Caliphate. In 800 CE, the Abbasid Caliphate was the largest empire on earth, stretching from Al-Andalus in Spain to the borders of India. The frontier was defended by a professional army and a network of fortified cities. But the empire was already beginning to fracture politically. Regional governors were becoming hereditary dynasties. Tax revenue was staying local instead of flowing to Baghdad. By 836 CE, Caliph al-Mu'tasim faced a critical problem. He couldn't trust the Arab military aristocracy. So he built a new army of Turkic slave soldiers, Mamluks, purchased from the Central Asian steppes. Within a generation, those soldiers controlled the caliphate. Between 861 and 870 CE, they murdered 4 caliphs. The border didn't collapse in a single event. It eroded. Turkish tribes began migrating into the eastern provinces, not as invaders, but as settlers filling depopulated agricultural land. The caliphs couldn't expel them because the caliphs didn't control their own armies anymore. By 945 CE, a Persian military dynasty, the Buyids, occupied Baghdad and reduced the caliph to a figurehead. The Abbasid Caliphate continued in name until the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258 CE, but it stopped being able to defend its frontiers around 900 CE, more than 3 centuries earlier. And here's where the pattern becomes unavoidable, because in every case so far, the border collapsed between 20 and 40 years after the fiscal crisis began. Not before, after. But we're not done yet. Byzantium. The Eastern Roman Empire survived the fall of the West by more than 1,000 years. It held Anatolia, the Balkans, and parts of Italy and North Africa. Its military system, the theme system, was arguably the most efficient pre-modern border defense ever created. Soldiers were granted land in frontier zones in exchange for hereditary military service. It was self-funding. It worked for 400 years, and then the empire started dismantling it. By 1025 CE, under Emperor Basil II, Byzantium had reached its medieval zenith. Basil died that year, and his successors faced a choice: maintain the theme system, which gave military power to provincial landholders, or centralize power by replacing those soldiers with mercenaries paid directly by the imperial treasury. They chose centralization. Between 1025 and 1071 CE, the theme armies were systematically defunded. The empire shifted to hiring mercenaries, Normans, Varangians, Turkic cavalry. This required more tax revenue. To raise that revenue, the emperors began seizing land from the military aristocracy, which destroyed the social base of the old system. On August 26, 1071 CE, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led an army, largely composed of unpaid, unreliable mercenaries, into battle against the Seljuk Turks at Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. The army disintegrated. Romanos was captured. And within a decade, Turkish tribes had occupied most of Anatolia, the heartland of the empire. But let's return to the question we opened with. Why do empires suddenly lose control of borders they defended for centuries? Here's the answer, and it's not what you'd expect. They don't lose control all at once. The loss is gradual, and it starts inside the empire, not at the frontier. Byzantium spent 46 years destroying its own military system before Manzikert. The battle didn't cause the collapse. It revealed that the collapse had already happened. But that raises the deeper question. Why did Byzantium dismantle a system that worked? Why did Rome invite the Goths inside? Why did the Abbasids build an army they couldn't control? Because in every case, the empire faced an internal political crisis that made short-term survival more important than long-term frontier defense. The border was sacrificed to buy time. And that brings us to the final case, Qing China. The Qing dynasty ruled China from 1644 to 1912 CE. At its height in the mid-18th century, it was the wealthiest state on Earth, controlling a population of more than 400 million people. Its northern and western frontiers were defended by Manchu banner armies and a network of tributary states. The First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 CE shattered the illusion of Qing strength. Britain forced the Treaty of Nanking, which ceded Hong Kong, opened 5 treaty ports, and imposed extraterritorial legal rights for British citizens. This wasn't a border collapse in the traditional sense. It was a forced breach of sovereignty. But here's what happened next. In 1850 CE, the Taiping Rebellion erupted in southern China. It lasted 14 years and killed at least 20 million people, possibly as many as 30 million. Every available Qing soldier was pulled into the interior to suppress the rebellion. The frontiers, north, west, and coast, were left undefended. Russia annexed the Amur River basin in 1858 CE. France established a protectorate over Vietnam in 1884 CE. Japan seized Taiwan in 1895 CE. European powers carved China into spheres of influence. And the Qing couldn't stop any of it, because the dynasty was fighting for survival against internal collapse. The Qing fell in 1912 CE, but the border had been irrelevant since the 1850s, 60 years earlier. 5 empires, same pattern. The border fails because the empire is already failing. But now we need to ask, what actually breaks first? Let's isolate the root causes. What preceded the border collapse in every case? First, fiscal crisis. Not just a budget shortfall, a structural inability to fund the military at the level required to hold the frontier. In Han China, it was floods and famine that destroyed the tax base. In Rome, it was a combination of plague, civil war, and a debased currency. In the Abbasid Caliphate, it was the fragmentation of the tax system as governors became independent. In Byzantium, it was the cost of shifting from a self-funding theme system to hired mercenaries. In Qing China, it was the cost of suppressing the Taiping Rebellion while paying indemnities to foreign powers. The fiscal crisis appeared, on average, 20 to 30 years before the border collapsed. Second, military recruitment failure. Every empire in this analysis reached a point where it could no longer recruit enough soldiers from its core population. Rome turned to Germanic foederati. The Abbasids turned to Turkish Mamluks. Byzantium turned to mercenaries. The Qing turned to regional warlords and foreign-trained armies. This wasn't because the population disappeared. It was because the empire could no longer afford to pay soldiers, or because the political elite no longer trusted its own population under arms. The recruitment crisis appeared 10 to 20 years before the border collapsed. Third, internal political fragmentation. In every case, the center couldn't make the provinces obey anymore. Regional governors, warlords, or military commanders began acting independently. The border became a local concern, not an imperial one. And when that happened, local leaders made deals with outside groups, deals the central government couldn't reverse. This fragmentation appeared 5 to 15 years before the border collapsed. Do you see the timeline? The border is the last thing to fail. It fails because the empire has already lost the fiscal capacity, the military capacity, and the political capacity to defend it. So when we look at modern border challenges, and I'm going to name specific data here, not to make a political claim but to show the pattern, what are we actually seeing? The United States spent $1.1 trillion on defense in 2023. That's approximately 3.5% of GDP and 13% of federal spending. By comparison, Rome was spending about 70% of revenue on the military by 400 CE. The U.S. is not in fiscal crisis by historical standards. The European Union has a combined GDP of $17 trillion and a population of 450 million. The migration crisis of 2015 to 2016 involved approximately 1.3 million asylum applications. By comparison, Rome accepted 200,000 Goths in 376 CE into an empire with a population of about 55 million. The scale is not comparable. China's defense budget in 2023 was approximately $230 billion, about 1.7% of GDP. The People's Liberation Army has 2 million active personnel. China is not experiencing a military recruitment crisis. So if modern states are not in the same fiscal, military, or political position as the empires we've examined, why does border control feel like a crisis? Because the perception of border loss creates political instability, even when the material capacity to defend the border still exists. The fear of losing control can be as destabilizing as actually losing control. And that fear can drive the same short-term political decisions that hollowed out Rome, Byzantium, and the Qing. The historical lesson is not that border loss causes collapse. The lesson is that internal weakness makes the border indefensible. And once that becomes visible, the political fractures accelerate. The question isn't whether a modern state can defend its borders. The question is whether it will destroy its own institutions in the attempt. In 376 CE, Rome let 200,000 Goths cross the Danube because it had already lost the ability to stop them. The border didn't fail Rome. Rome failed the border by breaking the systems that made defense possible in the first place. If border collapse is a symptom, not a cause, then what about currency collapse? Because in 4 of the 5 empires we just examined, the money failed before the frontier did. That's the next timeline we're mapping. If you want to see how empires lose control of their own currency, and how fast it happens once it starts, that's the next investigation.